I used to think silence was a form of love. That was the lie I told myself for 34 years. That the way my father moved through a room, quiet, contained, like a man perpetually bracing for something, was just his way of showing he cared. That the absence of words didn't mean the absence of feeling. That some men simply didn't know how to speak the things living inside their chests, and that was okay, and I needed to accept that, and one day it would all make sense. It took a wedding, a handshake, and the 3 longest seconds of my life to understand that silence isn't love. Silence is just silence. And some people choose it the same way they choose everything else, deliberately, completely, without apology. My name is Daniel Whitfield. I grew up in Harlan County, Kentucky, which is the kind of place that gets described in newspaper articles as forgotten or left behind, and the people who live there either wear that like a badge of pride or spend their whole lives trying to escape it. My father, Robert Whitfield, was the badge of pride type, 3rd-generation coal country, hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same rock he spent 20 years pulling apart underground. A man who believed deeply in 3 things: hard work, the Baptist church on Route 9, and the idea that a man's worth was measured entirely by how little he complained. He was not a cruel man. I want to say that clearly because this story could be mistaken for one about a monster, and he wasn't one. He coached my little league team until I was 12. He drove 4 hours round trip to watch me walk across a stage at the University of Kentucky. He fixed things, cars, gutters, busted screen doors with a patience and precision that I genuinely admired. He was there. Physically, consistently, reliably there. He just never said anything that mattered. And I spent my entire childhood trying to make him. I knew I was gay when I was 9 years old, though I obviously didn't have the language for it then. What I had was a feeling, warm and terrifying and persistent, whenever Tommy Brewer from down the road would take his shirt off to jump in the creek behind his house. I knew it was different from what the other boys felt. I knew it in the same way you know when you've stepped into a room you weren't supposed to enter. That sudden awareness of being somewhere wrong, somewhere that would get you in trouble if anyone found out. So I did what any kid in Harlan County in the early 90s would have done. I buried it. I buried it under baseball. I buried it under church attendance, where I sat in the 3rd pew on the left every Sunday morning and sang the hymns and took the communion and tried to pray the feeling away, the way the pastor sometimes referenced in his sermons when he talked about unnatural temptations. I buried it under years of carefully performed normalcy, dating girls I liked as people, but couldn't make myself want, throwing my voice into conversations about women the same way you throw your voice when you're trying to convince someone you're somewhere you're not. My father never said a word about any of it. Not encouragement, not suspicion, not curiosity. He watched me perform my entire adolescence from a distance of about 3 emotional feet, nodding occasionally, and I told myself that was enough. It was not enough. I left Kentucky at 18, and didn't look back in any meaningful way for almost a decade. University of Kentucky first, then a graduate program in urban planning at Ohio State, then a job with a city development firm in Columbus that kept me busy enough to confuse business with healing. I came out to myself completely at 22, in a Columbus apartment during a February ice storm, sitting on a bathroom floor after a date with a woman named Carrie who was wonderful and kind, and entirely wrong for me in the way that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with me. I cried for about 40 minutes, not because I was gay by then. I'd made my peace with that on a private level, but because I knew what it meant for everything else, for Harlan County, for the Baptist church on Route 9, for my mother who quilted Bible verses and hung them above the kitchen sink, for my father who had never in my memory said the words "I love you" but who showed up, who was always stubbornly physically there. I came out to my college friends first, then slowly to colleagues, then to my mother over the phone on a Tuesday night in March when I was 24. She cried. She said she needed time. She called back 4 days later and said she loved me and that she was trying and that she was sorry it had taken her 4 days. I told her it was okay. I meant it. My father was a different equation entirely. I didn't tell him for 3 more years. I'm not proud of that. But I also think anyone who grew up in a house with a man like my father, contained, unreadable, built like a wall, would understand that telling him felt less like a conversation and more like walking into something you couldn't walk back out of. I told him on a Sunday afternoon in October, sitting at the kitchen table in the house I grew up in while my mother found reasons to be in another room. I was 27. I had rehearsed the words so many times they felt worn smooth, like river stones. I said, "Dad, I'm gay. I've known for a long time. I should have told you sooner, and I'm sorry I didn't." He was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window above the sink. He looked at the table. Then he said, "You eat yet? Your mother made soup." And that was it, that was the whole conversation. He got up, ladled himself a bowl, and sat back down, and we talked about the weather and the state of the county road outside, and whether the gutters on the east side of the house needed replacing before winter. I drove back to Columbus 5 hours later feeling something I couldn't name for several days. It wasn't quite devastation. It wasn't quite relief. It was something more like the feeling you get when you finally open a door you've been afraid of for years, and there's nothing on the other side, just a wall. I met Marcus at a city planning conference in Cincinnati when I was 29. He was presenting a paper on mixed-income housing development that was both technically rigorous and genuinely funny, which was not a combination I'd encountered before in that particular context, and I found myself watching him from 3 rows back with the specific kind of attention that had nothing to do with urban planning. Marcus Webb, raised in Atlanta by a mother who taught high school English and a father who coached college football. Tall, precise, with a laugh that arrived suddenly and filled whatever room it was in. He had a way of listening, completely still, fully present, that made you feel like whatever you were saying was the only thing that mattered. I had never in my life felt listened to the way Marcus listened to me, and I think I fell in love with him somewhere in the middle of our second cup of coffee at a Starbucks in downtown Cincinnati at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. We did the long-distance thing between Columbus and Atlanta for 8 months. Then he took a position with a firm in Columbus and moved into my apartment on a rainy Saturday in April, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the specific chaos of 2 lives being merged, and it was the happiest I had ever been. My mother loved him immediately. She called him that lovely Marcus and asked about him every time we talked on the phone and sent him a birthday card his first year with us that included a $20 bill tucked inside, which she did for family. My father met him twice in the first 2 years we were together. Both times were polite, cordial. My father shook Marcus's hand. He asked him about his work. He passed him the bread at dinner. He said nothing wrong. He said almost nothing at all. Marcus, who had been warmly received by literally every other person in my life, noticed. He didn't make a big thing of it. He was kind about it the way he was kind about everything, carefully, without drama. But one night in our Columbus apartment, lying in the dark, he said quietly, "Your dad, does he know we're serious?" "He knows," I said. "Does he care?" I thought about it for a long time. "I genuinely don't know," I said, and I think that's the part that's hardest. Marcus proposed in March, the year I turned 33. He did it in our kitchen on a Sunday morning in pajamas with no grand gesture, just the ring in a small velvet box and his eyes doing the thing they did when he was saying something he meant completely. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We called his parents first. His mother screamed. His father said, "It's about time," which was the single greatest thing anyone had ever said to me. Then I called my parents. My mother cried happy tears. She asked immediately about dates and colors and whether we'd thought about a venue. She was already in it, already building the day in her mind, already making it real. My father said, "Congratulations, you want to talk to your mother." I held the phone for a second before I answered. "Yeah, Dad, put her on." We planned the wedding for October. Asheville, North Carolina, neutral ground, beautiful in the fall, far enough from Harlan County to feel like a different world, but close enough that my parents could drive it in 3 hours. We booked a restored barn venue outside the city with string lights and exposed beams, and a catering team that did the most extraordinary pulled pork I've ever tasted in my life, which mattered to me in a way I couldn't entirely explain, except that it felt like the South showing up for us in a way I needed it to. The months before the wedding, I called my father more than I usually did, not about anything specific, whether county politics, the gutters, which it turned out did need replacing. I was trying to build something, some kind of bridge, some version of closeness that I could carry into that October day and feel okay about. He was the same as he always was, present, quiet, reliable as stone and just as hard to read. 3 weeks before the wedding, I asked him directly. We were on the phone and I just said it, without building up to it, because I was 33 years old and I was done building up to things. "Dad, are you okay with this, with the wedding, with Marcus? Are you actually okay, or are you just tolerating it?" The pause was long enough that I counted seconds, 6 of them. "I'm coming, aren't I?" he said. "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "Daniel," he said, in a tone that meant the conversation was over. I let it go. I always let it go. That was the dance we'd done my entire life and I knew every step of it, and I was too tired to learn a new one 3 weeks before my wedding. The morning of the wedding was cold and clear in the way that October mornings in the Blue Ridge Mountains can be, the kind of air that feels cleaned. Marcus's family arrived the night before, and his mother had swept me into a hug the moment she walked through the hotel lobby door that felt like being caught by something. His father had shaken my hand with both of his, and his sister had immediately started rearranging the wedding favor table in a way that was bossy and completely welcome. My parents arrived the morning of. My mother came into the bridal suite. We'd repurposed it as the groom's room, which made us both laugh, and held my face in her hands and looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. And then she said, "You look like yourself today. You look like exactly yourself." I had to look at the ceiling for a minute after that one. My father stood in the doorway behind her. He was wearing the navy suit he'd bought for my cousin's wedding 8 years ago, and it still fit him perfectly because he was the kind of man who maintained himself through sheer discipline. His hair had gone fully white in the last few years. He looked older than I expected, the way parents always look older than you expect when you don't see them constantly, and something moved through me that I wasn't prepared for, something adjacent to grief, or maybe just the recognition of time passing. He stepped into the room. He looked at me. He nodded once, the way he nodded at things he approved of: new tires on a truck, a well-maintained fence line. Then he said, "You need anything?" And I said no, and he said, "All right then," and stepped back toward the doorway. I almost let him go. Almost, but something in me, some version of the 9-year-old boy who spent his whole childhood trying to crack this man open, said one more thing. "Dad," I said, "I'm really glad you're here." He looked at me for a moment. "Where else would I be?" he said, not a question, a statement. And then he went out into the hall, and I stood there trying to figure out if that was the most he was capable of or the most I was ever going to get, and I honestly wasn't sure there was a difference. The ceremony was everything. I want to say that plainly, without embellishment, because it deserves to be said that way. The barn was full of golden October light, and the people we loved most in the world, and Marcus stood at the end of that aisle looking at me the way he always looked at me, completely, fully, without reservation, and every wall I had ever built around myself came down so fast I barely felt them go. We'd written our own vows. Marcus went first, and he talked about the Thursday night in Cincinnati and the conference and the second cup of coffee, and I was crying before he finished the third sentence. Then it was my turn, and I had my paper in my hand, and I looked out at the people in front of me, and my eyes found my father's face in the third row, and I made a decision. I put the paper down. I said what I actually meant. I talked about growing up in a place that didn't have room for who I was, and about carrying that for years, and about what it means to find a person who makes room, all the room, more room than you knew you needed. I talked about learning to trust someone with the parts of yourself you've kept hidden so long they've started to feel like secrets even from yourself. I said that Marcus had taught me that love wasn't something you performed or proved or earned. It was something you simply received, if you could get out of your own way long enough to let it in. I looked at my father while I said that last part. I don't know why, I didn't plan to. His face was unreadable, the way it always was, and he was sitting very still, and I couldn't tell if he was moved or distant or somewhere in between. I looked away. I finished my vows. Marcus kissed me and the room erupted, and October light poured through the barn windows like something holy, and for that moment, that specific, perfect moment, I let myself stop waiting for anything from anyone. The reception was loud and warm and full. Marcus's family danced like they'd been waiting all year for permission, and my mother danced with Marcus's father, and Marcus's sister gave a toast that was so funny and so loving that I laughed until I cried for the second time that day. I moved through the room feeling lighter than I ever had, receiving people's love like I'd learned, finally, how to do it. I found my father standing near the bar at the edge of the room, holding a glass of water, watching everything with that same contained, unreadable expression. I walked over to him. We stood next to each other for a minute, watching Marcus on the dance floor with his mother, this big joyful person in the middle of all that light, and I said, "He's something, isn't he?" My father watched him for a moment. "He is," he said. Then Marcus spotted us from across the room and crossed toward us, and his face was open and warm and flushed from dancing, and he extended his hand to my father the way he always did, without hesitation, without testing the waters, just completely himself. And my father shook it, firmly, looked him in the eye. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Marcus said, "Thank you for being here, sir. It means a lot to both of us." My father held his gaze and said, "Good wedding." And then he glanced at me, just briefly, just a flicker, and then he looked back at his water glass. That was it. That was all. I watched my father standing there at the edge of the happiest day of my life, and I understood something for the first time with a clarity that felt almost physical. He had come. He had put on the navy suit. He had driven 3 hours. He had shaken the hand of the man I loved and looked him in the eye and said 2 words that, coming from Robert Whitfield, maybe constituted a complete sentence. And he could not say he was proud. I don't know why, whether it was the church or the county or simply the particular architecture of his heart, the way it had been built so long ago that no one could modify the structure now. I don't know if he felt proud and simply had no access to the words. I don't know if there was some piece of him that was still sorting out what I was to him, what this day was, what his presence here meant. I don't know if he would ever know himself. What I know is that it hurt. That standing 3 feet from my father on my wedding day and feeling that specific absence, the absence of "I'm proud of you," or "you look happy," or even just "I love you, son," was its own kind of grief. A grief without a clean edge, without a place to bury it. The grief of losing something you never actually had. We danced the father-son dance. I'd chosen an old country song my father used to play in the truck when I was small, something by Merle Haggard that I always associated with the particular smell of his flannel jacket and the way the Kentucky hills looked in early morning light. I'd chosen it because it was the only language I knew we shared, that music, those hills, that particular quiet country sadness that neither of us had ever been able to name out loud. He danced the way you'd expect, stiffly, slightly off the beat, clearly uncomfortable with being watched, but he was there. He held my shoulder and he moved across the floor with me, and he was present in the only way he knew how to be. I put my hand on his arm at the end of the song, just for a second. I said, "Thanks for coming, Dad, really." He looked at me, his jaw moved slightly. He seemed, for just a moment, like a man reaching for something just out of reach, some word or phrase living on a shelf too high for his hands. His eyes were doing something I hadn't seen before, something that might have been emotion if emotion was a language he'd ever been taught to speak. Then he nodded, patted my shoulder twice, the way he patted things, a reliable truck engine, a fence post that was going to hold, and he walked back to his table. My parents left around 9. My mother hugged me for a long time at the door and whispered something in my ear that I will keep forever. Then she stepped back and looked at my father expectantly, the way wives look at husbands when they're trying to give them the signal to do the human thing. He stepped forward, he put both hands on my shoulders, he looked at me. The moment stretched out. I was 33 years old and I was back in that kitchen at 27, watching him look at his hands, and I was 12 in the bleachers waiting to see if he'd look up from the scorebook when I crossed home plate, and I was 9 years old by the creek, trying to understand why I felt like something was always being kept from me. He pulled me into a hug, brief and firm the way he did everything, his hand on the back of my head for just a second, 1 second, the way you'd hold something you were afraid of dropping, then he stepped back. "Drive safe getting home," he said. He turned and walked to the car. My mother gave me a look that held 30 years of marriage and all its complicated translations. She squeezed my hand, then she followed him. I stood in the doorway of that Asheville barn and watched the taillights of my father's truck disappear into the October dark. The music was still going behind me. Marcus's voice was somewhere in the room, that laugh filling the air. The night was cold and clear and full of stars, and the particular kind of silence that follows something that was almost said. I didn't call my father for 3 weeks after the wedding. Not out of anger. I was past anger, I think, or maybe anger, and I had simply reached an understanding that this was its resting shape. I didn't call because I needed to sit with what the day had been, all of it, the extraordinary joy of it and the specific quiet ache at its edges. When I finally called, we talked for 11 minutes. County road repairs, the gutters, he'd had them fixed, finally. Marcus's new project at work. My father listened, asked 2 or 3 questions, and then said he had to get the dog in before dark. Before he hung up, he said, "Your mother really enjoyed the wedding." "Me too," I said. A pause. "Yeah," he said, "it was a good day." That was everything. That was the full measure of it. It was a good day, and I sat with the phone in my hand after we hung up and I let myself feel what that was. Not what I'd wanted it to be. Not the conversation where he finally said the things I'd been waiting 33 years to hear. Just a man who drove 3 hours, put on a navy suit, shook my husband's hand, danced to a Merle Haggard song, and called it a good day. I've thought about this a lot since, about what we owe each other as parents and children, about whether showing up physically, persistently, year after year, the soup, the gutters, the 4-hour drive to a graduation, the 3-hour drive to a wedding counts as love even when the words never come, about whether it's possible to love someone completely and still fail them in a way they'll spend their whole life feeling. I think the answer is yes. I think both things can be true at once, and that's the part that takes the longest to make peace with. Marcus and I have been married for 2 years now. We live in a house in Columbus with a garden that Marcus tends with a care and patience that looks, sometimes, almost like my father's hands working on something broken. We talk about everything. We are, between the two of us, the kind of people who talk about everything, and one of the things we talk about is my father, and what I'm still learning to carry. Marcus has a theory, which he offers gently and without pressure. He thinks my father is proud of me. He thinks the navy suit and the 3-hour drive and the firm handshake and the "it was a good day" are in the emotional language my father actually speaks, roughly equivalent to a standing ovation. He thinks some people are built in a way that makes the most important things the hardest to say, and that this is a kind of tragedy for everyone involved, including the person who can't say them. I don't know if Marcus is right. Some days I believe it entirely. Some days the absence still has weight to it, still presses against something in my chest that I thought I'd learned to breathe around. What I've come to understand, and this is the thing I didn't have language for until recently, is that I spent most of my life trying to become something my father could be proud of out loud. A version of Daniel Whitfield that would finally crack that man open, finally get behind the wall, finally produce those words I needed like water. I shaped choices and buried truths, and performed normalcy for years around that hope. And what Marcus gave me, what loving Marcus and being loved by him in the full and complete way that I am, is the understanding that I was always already enough. That the approval I was chasing was never the point of the story. That the love I was starving for was available to me the whole time, from other people, from myself, if I could get out of my own way long enough to receive it. My father shook my husband's hand, firmly, looked him in the eye, drove 3 hours, put on the suit, stayed for the whole reception, danced to Merle Haggard with his son. He never said he was proud. I'm learning, slowly, some days more than others, to hold both of those things at once. To love my father for what he is and mourn the version of him I needed and never got. To stop waiting for a conversation that may never happen, and to choose, instead, the life already in front of me. The one that is full and loud and real. The one where Marcus's laugh fills the room. The one that is mine.